Hi everyone, and welcome to the last Australian Behavioural Science meetup of the year. We're very fortunate to have the one and only Rory Sutherland talking to us tonight, especially as it's 8 a.m. for him. So thank you very much, Rory, for making the time. Now, before I introduce Rory, I want to thank our sponsor, Plus UTS Business Futures. Plus UTS Business Futures is the enterprise learning arm of the UTS Business School and strong supporters of our behavioural meetups and have been for a couple of years now. They've delivered a range of customized and co-designed programs for leading orgs in highly collaborative ways across Australia. Plus, UTS Business Futures is very experienced and very able to assist your organizations achieve its goals through tailored programs that upskill your staff in ways that are relevant to your org. If you'd want to know more, please email them on business.futures@uts.edu.au. Now, Rory is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy UK and co-founder of its Behavioural Science division, Ogilvy Consulting. Few have contributed as much to the field of behavioural science as Rory. If you haven't already, check out some of his TED Talks on YouTube. Many have over 1 million views. Read his incredible books like Alchemy, The Dark Art, Curious Science of Creating Magic in Brands, Business and Life, or check out some of his behavioural science courses. You won't be disappointed. And whether this is your first time seeing Rory present or you've had the good fortune of seeing him before, you're in for a treat, as Rory's talks are as always entertaining and always thought-provoking. Tonight, Rory is going to take a look back at some of his biggest behavioural science takeouts for 2023, and I can't wait to see what you come up with, mate. So please type your questions in the chat, and Merle will curate Q&A at the end, although Rory might do a curveball. Without further ado, over to you, Rory.
Excellent. Okay. Right. What I'm going to talk about first is the replication crisis, because it would be completely wrong not to address a review of 2023 without mentioning it. And the one thing I would say is, first of all, in some senses, it's much less of an issue in business, perhaps, than it is in academia, because a lot of those studies were done with, I would say, absurdly small sample sizes. That's the first fact I'd make a point of, which is that generally, if you're in some sort of commercial business, you can't really afford a test unless it has a bearing on 20, 30, 40,000 people. And let's be honest about it, okay, your test is probably better funded, okay, than it would be in an academic context. So, you know, the typical tests we used to do in direct marketing, for example, back in the day, if you're using direct mail, typically in direct mail, you might have a response rate of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. You generally have a test cell of 50,000 people. And so in a reasonably large country, and even in quite a small country, the kind of scale you use in doing a test is going to be a lot larger. And therefore, the likelihood of, well, p-hacking, for example, is therefore much more remote. Now, there were cases, by the way, I can think of where we kind of hacked the result. And this is from a commercial standpoint. So we were testing 2 creative approaches to a charity mailing. And we had an argument about this, whether it was okay or not. And the creative route A, for I think it was Save the Children, actually raised more money to an equally sized cell than it did for creative route B. But creative route B effectively received more donations. And we thought this was slightly unusual. And so we looked at the data at the individual level and discovered that the reason creative route A had a higher average donation is that one person had received a letter through the post, a direct mail letter, and sent in a check for £40,000. Okay. And once you actually remove that one rogue variable from the result, effectively, it was then fairly clear that creative route B was the better route. It had a higher average donation and a larger number of donations, but this one complete outlier had effectively skewed the data. I'm not sure it wasn't £100,000. It was certainly just an absolutely monstrous donation. And this, of course, in a sense, makes Nassim Taleb's point that you've got to be very, very careful about averaging in extremistan. You know, average height kind of works because there aren't people who are 300 feet tall, but averaging in a world where there are extreme outliers is a dangerous thing to do. Now, I did actually argue the counter opinion, which is that there may be a facet to creative route A that massively appeals to people with enormous checkbooks. But I said, since we only have one piece of evidence of this, okay, we can't really make that a reliable assumption going forward. So we did actually effectively perform, a little bit of, if you were data collader, you'd say, look, why did you remove that particular outlier? But in that case, I think we had a good case to do it. But I think exactly that kind of behavior has been rife in social science research, where people know effectively you can either create a p-hacking result by narrowing down your effectively post the research, narrowing down a particular group and saying, well, it does work for women, people over 27, whatever it may be. You can simply just do a little cunning chop on your overall data set and then get a meaningful result. Obviously, it's much easier to do if you have smaller sample sizes, and it's obviously easy to do if you're willing to cheat. The only thing I would say is this has caused a massive kind of crisis of confidence in the behavioral science area. And in fact, I really recommend my ex-colleague, brilliant guy, former colleague, Peter Judo Duhato, who used to produce a behavioral science blog I think it's on YouTube under the name of Judo Pete, and he now actually has devoted his blog to what is effectively cases of scientific fraud. And it's worth noting, by the way, that in academia the incentives are different than in the private sector. In the private sector, you do it because you do want to improve your measurable results going forwards. Okay, so p-hacking wouldn't be a great idea if it meant that your actual profits or successful take-up of pensions or whatever it was actually effectively compromised by your performance of fraud. So you are trying to do something going forwards. You're trying to effectively use the test to make a future decision, not to get a paper published then and there. So as I said, larger sample sizes in the private sector. Second thing is we're actually probably trying to actually find something out in as far as it might be true so that we can make use of it later, which is also different because in a sense, once you publish a paper and you get the credits for it, you don't have to really think about the consequences, to be absolutely honest, because they fall on other people, which is what makes this so morally questionable. Thirdly, you've got to look at incentives in academia, where this thing of kind of publish or be damned and the obsession with publication volume as an absolutely appalling proxy measure for the productivity of academics has undoubtedly become rife, which is a product of, I think, our obsession with the quantification of everything. There's a fourth point, which is that in many ways, okay, what we're usually testing in the private sector or indeed in the applied behavioral science sector, we're testing something in the setting in which we expect the finding to be used, okay? So, you are actually testing something which is roughly akin to reality, to your proposed reality. An awful lot of the social science research that doesn't replicate are actually, I think they divide into two. There are cases where it's purely like, here's this finding which suggests something we've either believed or suggest we can fraudulently create, okay? But they're often a very artificial setting. I'll give you an example of that. It doesn't surprise me for a second that the paradox of choice experiments don't always replicate, because whether too much choice is a problem, as behavioral economists often believed, or it's an opportunity on improvement in utility, as economists tend to believe, which of those two is true depends very much on the individual context. And so two things I can remember from this. I remember reading an experiment on kind of honesty and reciprocation, where they handed some people, someone claimed to be leaving town and said, look, I'm leaving town, why don't you have these casino chips? And if you like, you can give them some to that guy over there, the guy over there being a stooge. And the whole purpose was, when people had an unexpected windfall, did they feel the urge to share? Okay, now they chose Las Vegas as the location for their experiment because it enabled them to tell this kind of plausible story about why they were giving away casino chips. And so it was a kind of experiment on altruism. Now, my only quibble with that is that experiment didn't work. Now, my only argument there was that, look, let's be honest about this, okay? If anybody's seen the film Focus, they'll know this. Vegas is basically the scam capital of the United States, okay? If you're in Vegas and you are the victim of an act of generosity, your first reaction is going to be suspicion. You know, it's not, yeah, let's go along with this guy because this is obviously great. If someone does something like that to you in Vegas, your first reaction is going to be, what the hell is going on here? And I need to be really careful. Not, wow, what a windfall. It's, this is possibly a scam and I need to be on high alert. And just to give a parallel experiment, if you'd had a stooge and again, an experimental subject sitting outside a tea shop in the West Country in Devon, and the owner of the tea shop comes out and goes, oh, actually, my love, I seem to have baked too many scones today. So would you like to take 10 of these home? Or if you want to share them with that man over there, maybe you'd like to give him 2 or 3, right? All I'm saying is the mental, emotional state you're going to be in a Devon tea shop versus like a bus shelter in Las Vegas, okay? They're going to be very different. And we wouldn't expect replication there because a large part of the lesson of behavioral science is just that context really matters. And the human is not a narrow, rationalizing, context-free animal which has a perfect utilityometer on board. That's the kind of mistaken belief of economics, which behavioral economics was there to correct. And that context and mood and things matter. But the other point I'll make is that mostly you test things that make a difference or might make a difference in applied behavioral science. When you look at the experiments that failed to replicate, a lot of them are, well, kind of dumb, okay, right? I mean, that experiment famously that's been attacked that says that networking makes you feel unclean. Okay, right. Okay. So the idea was you actually got people, and I can't remember whether you mentioned the phrase networking or you proposed networking or you got them to network, and they apparently showed an increased propensity to wash their hands. Well, if you look at Judo Pete's latest YouTube piece on that, he tells the story of an academic who was doing research into networking, and his academic supervisors to his PhD were continuing to insist that he included a reference to this research in his PhD because it came out of Harvard Business School. It was a very reputable and famous study on networking. And he kept trying to refuse to put it in because he said he didn't believe the research and he thought it was dumb and he didn't know what the implications were anyway, right? I mean, okay, there's a slight feeling, there's a slightly interesting potential insight there, which is we feel the act of networking is kind of necessary and we're driven to do it, but that deep down we'd rather not be doing it, if that research were true. It's not entirely clear how applicable that research is in any way, but you created this academic problem where, because it became famous, other people studying networking were always obliged to reference it. And so you get this massive winner-takes-all effect. But that research wasn't important, nor was the research in wherever it was, Antwerp, on, you know, people's reacting to rubbish. I mean, the research actually there was, to be honest, it wasn't even p hacking necessarily. It was just paper hacking. I've got an interesting theory which has no application to anybody ever, but I'm actually going to, you know, create a great result because it'll be a kind of, an eye-catching paper. And therefore it'll boost my career, particularly if I can get it published in some prestigious journal. And as I said, you know, it never surprised me that, by the way, okay, I still think personally, this is purely me, it's purely anecdotal and my own hunch, that getting people to sign at the top of an insurance form probably works, okay? Whether the data is valid or not, my second argument would be, I don't know if it works all the time, but if we still had paper insurance forms that people had to sign, I'd still recommend someone tested that. The reason a lot of those findings don't seem to replicate is they were then performed, the attempts at replication were performed in the online environment, where you actually, you know, checked your signature commitment at the top, where actually technically you're not signing anything necessarily, you might be, okay? But the online environment is totally different because you can then if you sign at the bottom in the online environment, you can go back and change your answers to make them more honest. Whereas in a paper environment, that would involve crossing out, which would be visible to the person who is actually looking at the form and arguably trigger a belief in your dishonesty. Now, interestingly, the same is also true of online forms, and online insurance companies do look at people who go back and alter their results, okay, right? But the thing is, the consumer mostly does not know this is going on, right? So if I were launching a paper insurance company, would I test sign at the top? Yeah, probably would, okay? And that's also worth noting, because some research that's proved to be fraudulent has nonetheless proved to be correct. So there is fraudulent research that kind of replicates. So there's a very famous academic called Burt, I think it was called Cyril Burt in the UK, who seems, although it's debated, who may have faked IQ data. However, that discredited, effectively, a field of research for ages, despite the fact that when genuine research was performed, it seemed to effectively suggest exactly the same thing about IQ, and whether you give that much credence to IQ as a measure is a totally separate question. But his research, if it was fraudulently generated, wasn't actually incorrect. So there's a huge danger here, which is we may go, well, you know, oh, look, that paper's been completely discredited. That doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true, okay, what the conclusion is. However, I do feel very, no, okay, I mentioned the fact about the paradox of choice problem, okay? Well, if you're in a supermarket, you're not really sure whether you want to buy any jam, okay? And you're presented with a stand with 26 types of jam. You're probably just going to go, too busy, haven't got time to make a decision, I'm going to walk on by. On the other hand, okay, if you'd driven with your family 35 miles to visit a superstore called World of Jam, you probably wouldn't come through the door and go, oh my God, there's just too much choice, I can't cope. So, you know, the fact that the paradox of choice for jam doesn't always replicate is not, absolutely not sufficient to say we no longer need to test the economic assumption that more choice leads to greater perceived, utility. Because I know of many business cases where businesses have been destroyed by bad choice architecture. I mean that quite literally. If you want to kill a business, really, really terrible choice architecture. You know, that's why a lot of software firms use good, better, best. It's because, broadly speaking, it's a fairly safe assumption that offering those three choices, it's not necessarily optimal, but it's not a terrible range of choice to offer. Okay, whereas there are some things which are literally fatal. So I got in touch with Nestle when they launched the Virtuo Nespresso machine, and they had two machines. They had the standard and the Nespresso Virtuo Plus, and the Plus had an automatic opening lid. It's not a big deal, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I can open a bloody lid, but the lid opened automatically at the touch of a button on the Plus, and you had to kind of clunk it with. When they first introduced them on sale, they sold them at exactly the same price. And I just contacted Nestle and said, you're pissing away value here, because if you call something the Plus, people, I said, doesn't matter if you charge £5 more, doesn't even matter if you charge £10 more, doesn't matter if you charge £20 more, but you can't have them at the same price, and you can't have the Plus costing less than the standard, because it just messes with people's heads and it destroys what Richard Thaler called the transaction utility. In other words, your comfort in having made a sensible decision, to such an extent that the most likely outcome is that people don't buy either of them. So is it worth testing choice architecture? Is it worth reducing choice and seeing if it increases sales and increases exactly the kind of conversion you want? You bet it is. That's still true. And in fact, I'd also say, okay, I don't think any of the findings in Cialdini, now it has to be said, if we're being brutal about it, that quite a lot of the findings in Thinking Fast and Slow don't replicate. Now, no one can criticize Daniel Kahneman because he was dealing with what was considered to be valid research at the time, and a lot of this stuff was very interesting, so it made it into the book. I'll be candid with you. I always thought priming was kind of bullshit, okay? And the kind of filter I use for deciding what might be bullshit is, can I see an evolutionary reason why this makes sense? In other words, in the evolutionary environment, concerning the evolution of the brain, does it make sense that we value things more highly if they're scarce? Yes. Does variable reinforcement make sense? Yeah, that makes sense. I can see why, if something's variable, you may want to persevere a lot longer than if it's predictable, for all kinds of reasons to do with the information architecture of the brain, foraging theory, that kind of thing. I think all of the things in Cialdini, you know, reciprocation bias makes absolute sense in a social species, right? Okay, it makes absolute, you know, there's absolutely a logical reason why some sort of instinct for reciprocation would make absolute sense in any kind of social species, and the fact that that's hardwired wouldn't surprise me at all. Priming, why? Right? I mean, why, if we're having a conversation about old people around a campfire on the savannah, why would it be to my evolutionary advantage to start walking around in a really slow way, right? Now, that's not to say that, weirdly, there is a priming experiment I know with a selection of wine, where if you play German music, you sell much more German wine, and if you play French music, you sell much more French wine. That's not totally impossible. The results were very, very convincing when I read them, and it doesn't strike me as totally unbelievable. And it does involve, by the way, real people in a real environment spending real money. So we have more reason to trust it than when it's a load of kind of postgrad students basically being paid to give up an afternoon. Okay, so I'm not saying that all priming doesn't work. I just thought some of those priming experiments struck me as pretty surprising, and the effects were often, in some cases, you know, just weirdly strong. So in some ways, you know, if you look at the Cialdini, you know, I think often Robert Cialdini doesn't get enough cred for this, because I have said, you know, before there was Kahneman and Tversky, in many ways, there was, I mean, okay, if you want my first behavioral economist or my first behavioral scientist, I go back to Aesop, and then you go to Jesus, right? I mean, the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the vineyard, you know, all of those things are effectively, so the parables are often sort of social science experiments. Okay, they're, you know, and the lost sheep is loss aversion. You know, the parable of the vineyard, where some people turn up and are paid the same day wage as the people who've been working all day. That's kind of an interesting economic parallel on perceived fairness. Okay, you know, there's an interesting thing going on there. So, you know, Adam Smith was undoubtedly a behavioral scientist. I mean, he's a philosopher, behavioral scientist, and economist, I would argue. And he's just known as an economist in retrospect, because they didn't have, you know, they didn't call people behavioral scientists in the 18th century, and all kinds of other reasons. But, you know, before there was Kahneman and Tversky, in many ways, there was Robert Cialdini, was the first person to actually go and explore this. And I think his stuff basically replicates to the extent that anything replicates, which is it's worth trying. And where possible, the model in which you experiment should be as close as possible to the model of reality. In other words, you should use your experimental findings in a way as similar as possible contextually to the environment in which the experiment was performed. And given that caveat, which tends to happen in the applied behavioral science world, but not in the kind of, hey, let's publish a paper and, you know, do a bit of p-hacking world, I'm much less concerned than everybody else. And apart from anything else, you know, as I said, I didn't expect all this stuff to replicate all the time, because context really matters. You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but the experiments you perform in Vegas probably only work in Vegas, right? Or in this case, they failed in Vegas for reasons which struck me as blindingly bloody obvious, to be honest. So that's me there on that, as far as it goes. But I couldn't really deal with 2023 without talking about this. And by the way, how far this goes and how far it turns out to go is scary, because I would kind of understand in a way some of the egregious fraud that's going on. And then at first I couldn't understand it when it was often such rather dumb experiments which had no commercial value, but were merely kind of, you know, curious. There were some of them interesting hypotheses, don't get me wrong, and you want to test them. And then I didn't really understand what you might call the pressure to publish. And of course, a null hypothesis in the business world isn't that bad because it tells you not to bother. So you've saved some money by testing, right? If basically the null hypothesis comes out, if nothing happens. Thank you, Mike. That's the first. Thank you. You said because I always thought instinctively that the signing at the top, that was in the chat, by the way, I always thought instinctively that the signing on the top would actually work, would make a difference. If you think about it, by the way, when people give evidence in court, at least in Australia and the UK, they actually give an oath to tell the truth before they start giving evidence, not at the end. Okay, it's not a stupid order. There's nothing weird about this. It's just there was a tradition that forms actually tended to end with your signature at the bottom. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you for that. That's absolutely brilliant. So I do make that important caveat, that, by the way, that just because the finding was fraudulently obtained does not mean it is not true. So that is a really important one. It happened with Cyril Burt in the UK. Next point, thank you very much for the link to Pete Judo's YouTube channel. He's a brilliant, brilliant guy, and it's worth going on, down to his back catalogue and looking at all the research. He's a Warwick postgraduate student in behavioural science. He joined us for a time and now works much more lucratively somewhere else, I'm sorry to say, because he's brilliant. But he's now actually effectively pivoted his channel towards investigation of what is some pretty extreme. But then in a weird way in academia, you've got some worry, it's such a reputational kind of zero-sum game, academia, that the incentives to cheat, okay? Now, broadly speaking, if you cheat in business, you probably end up losing money, so it's not a great idea. But also, 3 or 4 people can come up with the same finding in business and they can all make money from it. In academia, the huge pressure is to be there first, right? Because who came third is like forgotten and irrelevant and doesn't get tenure. And so there's much less of a kind of zero-sum game mentality in the commercial world, or indeed in the public, in many ways, in policy making and public health. Because in public health, actually, if you nick an idea from somewhere else and you and it works, you still get a large part of the credit. The fact that you nicked it from a different country doesn't really invalidate the fact that you're good at your job. Whereas, of course, in the academic world, what's the point of trying to replicate anything? Because if you succeed, you don't get any particular credit, and if you fail, as Peter Judo's YouTube channel shows, the consequences were they originally basically wouldn't allow him to produce his PhD without referencing what turned out to be fraudulent research. When he then published a big attack on this research in his PhD, because they told him to reference it and he referenced it negatively, basically the extraordinary reputation bias in academia, in other words, the deference bias to people who are famous and the absolute terror of criticizing them, okay? They were more or less trying to suppress this guy. That's horrific, okay? Now, in the business world, I often joke about this, which is the whole trick about business is finding out what other people are wrong about. It's not necessarily being right. It's the biggest business gains come if you can find something that everybody else believes that isn't true, or that can be refined, or that can be redefined or reframed or something like that. And as a consequence, there are good financial incentives for dissidents. It turns out that in academia, there are enormous financial incentives towards conformity. And that strikes me as a flaw in the whole academic structure, effectively, the whole incentive structure of academia, which really, really needs to be addressed. The idea that if you merely suggest that someone of high prestige might be wrong, then it's bad. If you suggest that they're wrong and that they faked something, then it's potentially career-ending. I think that's absolutely terrifying. I mean, it doesn't happen in maths, right? You don't get this stuff in maths where you have, oh, which paper did you publish in? Because in maths, nobody cares which paper you published in, because if you're a very famous mathematician and some guy living with his mum in a basement in Moscow points out that a flaw in your reasoning, then you're wrong. It doesn't matter where, he can just post that on the internet, right? And it's correct, you know, and immediately all the other mathematicians either go, this guy's talking bullshit, or no, that's a fair criticism. You don't need all this, how prestigious is your paper thing in maths, okay? Because it doesn't really matter. Whereas the extent to which paper prestige really, really matters in the academy is, particularly in economics, by the way. And also the extent to which, okay, let me tell you the best story. If you probably all know The Market for Lemons by George Akerlof, which is all about market failure caused by information asymmetries, okay? And they published that paper, which won him the Nobel Prize in economics, and which is probably one of the 10 most cited papers in economics, even today, that was published, I guess, in the 70s, okay? And Akerlof's pretty old now. That paper, okay, was turned down by about 5 economic things. 4 of them turned it down because they thought it was trivial, and 1 of them turned it down because they said if this were true, economics would be different. Okay, which is like the worst possible reason to turn down a scientific paper you can possibly imagine, which is we cannot possibly accept this paper because it has implications for the field in which we are currently invested. And I do think there is this, we've given the whole idea that because it's academic and therefore non-commercial, it must somehow be purer and truer than research published by practitioners. I think we've got to be very careful about that assumption, by the way. Most really good scientific progress actually has come from practitioners, not from theory. If you think about it, from everything from Viagra to penicillin to to the Wall's Viennetta to stainless steel to the steam engine, if you look at all those things, they were actually produced by tinkerers in the practical space, and the actual theory, what you might call the codification, came later. So I don't think we should apologize for being practitioners in any way. Darwin was absolutely the classic case of that, right? I mean, he wasn't theorizing. That was what the theologians were doing, the theory of the creation of the world, right? They were the dogmatists. He was wandering around looking at things, okay? And by the way, really good progress is just as likely to come from accident. I will add one point before we go into the Q&A. I was going to talk about this a bit, which is, I don't know how many of you are Australian, but I think Australia's policy on vaping is proper whack, okay? Now, I do have a dog in this fight, which is that very, very early on in the days of electronic cigarettes, I know a little bit about behavior, habit forming, and I also knew as a former smoker that what made smoking addictive was not merely nicotine. Okay, I think just going, okay, we will replace smoking with a nicotine patch is a kind of weird example of what I call the Dorman fallacy, where you define the function of something very narrowly and then try and replicate the narrowly defined function on the assumption that the Dorman fallacy, just so you know, is you get rid of a hotel, you define a hotel doorman that's function as opening the door, you get rid of the doorman, replace him with an automatic door opening mechanism, and lay claim to the cost savings through automation, despite the fact that actually only a small part of the doorman's ultimate value is opening the door, right? And so what you do is what you fail to realize is that doorman is also about security, recognition, status, all manner of things, hailing taxis, carrying bits of luggage occasionally. Okay, that actually what this doorman fallacy leads you to do is to make dumb and impressive looking cost cuts where the value that replaces the cost that you've cut is only only replaced to a very limited extent. Okay. And a similar example, AI with student essays, right? Now, if you want to produce a student essay, AI will do the job brilliantly, right? Okay, it'll structure the whole thing. It'll give you a kind of argument. It'll definitely get you a kind of B minus or it'll get you a B minus, okay? There's a problem there because I don't think any of you who left university have ever kept or reread any of the essays you wrote while you're at university. In fact, you probably chucked them in the bin the moment you got your degree certificate. And that's because the value of producing an essay as a student isn't the essay. The value is the process you go through to produce the essay. And the process is painful and involves marshalling your thoughts, acquiring and perhaps memorizing information, ordering and structuring the information into some sort of coherent argument, coming up with an opinion in the first place. Okay, those are the valuable things. The essay is actually a means to that end, right? Now, if you short circuit that process and you can go straight from question to essay without going through all the painful, laborious and time consuming intermediate stages, okay, then your essay is worthless. It's still an essay. The end product's still the same, but it's worthless. Now, in the same way in advertising, what's happened in the advertising industry is a load of media people have worked out how to make a load of money out of automation, because automation is always very profitable, okay? And they've automated the process of producing ads. But arguably the most valuable thing in advertising wasn't actually the ad, it was the process you went through to create it, which tended to generate a lot of insights. It generated really interesting questions. Who are we talking to? What do we say? What makes us different from our competitors? What can we say that our competitors can't say? Is there a moment in which we need to talk to people at which they're most receptive to what we might be saying? All those painful, time-consuming conversations were probably more than 50% of the value of producing a small advertising campaign. I'm not, you know, most of the really interesting insights that have made companies billions have come in some way out of marketing conversations. And if you short circuit that process by going straight from business to ad, what you appear to be doing is making something much more efficient, but what you're actually doing is making it much less valuable. And so in a similar way, I think that the idea of nicotine patches going, well, they need nicotine, they're addicted to nicotine, so we'll give them nicotine in a patch, okay, or a gum, that'll be fine, okay, was completely missing the whole nature of addiction, actually, which is a lot of it's kind of very weird, behavioural, a lot of it, I think, is kind of embodied, okay? So my view is that, you know, first of all, I don't think nicotine's, you know, that harmful a drug. Now, just to be clear, I'm talking about nicotine, not the combustible delivery device that was a cigarette, okay? I just don't think it's that bad a drug. I think it sits somewhere around the caffeine level in terms of harm, and I just don't think it's that bad, okay? I mean, nobody smokes 3 cigarettes too many and crashes into a bus queue. They don't beat up their spouse because they don't get into a fight. They don't hit their kids because they've smoked too much nicotine, okay? Genuinely speaking, in terms of the externalities, it's just not that bad. And so I went to the behavioral insights team in the very early days of electronic cigarettes and said, because this mimics the behavior of smoking, not just the ingestion of nicotine, I think it could be the most important thing in smoking cessation. And then I said, that's not my interesting prediction. My interesting prediction is that everybody in public health will try and ban this thing because they're kind of idiots, right? Okay. And they'll immediately start going, oh, think of the children. Well, actually, I shouldn't tell you this, okay? But smoking doesn't, even smoking cigarettes doesn't really do significant long-term health damage until you're about 35. That was the second finding from Sir Richard Doll's research, in which he conclusively proved that smoking was unbelievably linked with lung cancer, okay? So now, the think of the children argument, yeah, I get it with school kids. Well, then just don't sell them to school kids and have really strong penalties for people who do. Yes, you can't stop older kids selling them to younger kids. I get all that stuff. I'm simply saying, okay, that in the scheme of things, when you have lots of hard drugs kicking around, this isn't the worst thing your kids could be doing. So let me just get this thing back on track. It's gone weird. I'm so sorry. I don't know why it's doing this. It's overheated. I can switch cameras in a second. Don't worry. This is, oh, that's really weird. Oh, yeah, let's try that. But the point I'm making here, how strange. It's never done this before. Oh, there we are. That seems to have vaguely recovered its own self-centering control. It doesn't really matter that much, okay? In the scheme of things, this drug isn't that bad. The real point you've got to understand is harm reduction, which is the perfect is often the enemy of the good. And now, when I said that a lot of people in public health are basically sort of idiots who go, our job is to stop people. Now, ASH, which is a UK group, stands for Action on Smoking and Health, who were the most fanatical anti-smoking lobby group back in the 70s, 80s and 90s. They were the people who, when you could smoke in pubs, they wanted to ban smoking on the street, never mind in pubs, okay? They were really, really extreme. And I thought they'd be the worst opponents of vaping. Now, the interesting thing is they weren't. They were actually incredibly intelligent. They looked at the question. They said the reason we oppose smoking is because it kills people. We don't oppose smoking because people are ingesting nicotine. We're opposed to smoking because it kills people. If you have a way of ingesting nicotine, which is, let's say, an order of magnitude or two safer, then we should encourage people to switch to the safer form and not die. Okay, it's not like rocket science. If there's a better alternative to something that isn't perfect, you go along with it. Now, at the moment, I can't consume caffeine because I've just had some surgery, which for complicated reasons means I'm off caffeine for 3 months. Okay, I don't drink alcohol very much. Okay, I don't do dope or pot. Never have done. Tried it once or twice. Didn't like it that much. Okay, I don't do any other drugs. I don't do any class A drugs. You know, give me a fucking break. Okay, I mean, vaping is about the only thing I've got, right? And so all I'm saying here is that I think the Australian and New Zealand position on it is just hysterical and ridiculous. And as evidence of that, I'd simply say that Sweden and the UK, which are the two countries in Europe which are most liberal towards what you might call nicotinous alternatives, harm reduction, are also the two countries with the lowest rate of smoking. Now, there's a second point I'll make, which I don't think gets made often enough, okay, which is that the way of discouraging smoking through taxation has mostly worked. It is, since the remaining smokers tend to be poor, it is unbelievably cruel, okay? Which is that literally you are preventing people saving, you're destroying people's cash flow. Now, when rich people smoke, maybe you could argue that just ramping the price of cigarettes up all the time is somehow a great idea, okay? Now, when mostly poor people smoke, you have to find some alternative. When I go into vape shops in the UK, most of the people in there are poorer. They're from lower socioeconomic groups, they're manual workers, a painter and decorator who use vaping to quit smoking after he'd been a smoker for 40 years, okay? Now, the point I'm making there is that the kids' argument is a bit fucking specious. I mean, it's always, oh, think children. I mean, it's like, this is pathetic because all you got to do is mention children in any context and you consider you've won your argument. Well, my children have just been through university. They've just been through school, right? They've been through university in the middle of an absolutely active drug culture with all kinds of weird shit spreading around. Let me put it this way. Worry number 207 was that they might take up vaping. I was 10 times more worried by alcohol than I was by nicotine. About 20 times more worried, right? Because alcohol can mean they do stupid things. They might have an alcohol problem, which is really catastrophic, okay? If you have a problem relationship with alcohol, that's your life screwed, okay? They might end up doing stupid things to other people. They might end up having other people doing stupid things to them. They might get into an accident. There are loads and loads of reasons to be worried about alcohol. Trust me, I mean, vaping doesn't even figure on the same chart. So I think the extreme Australia, New Zealand approach is just totally whack, and that you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Because what you're also doing is now perpetuating economic warfare, typically on people in the poorest quartile of society, and on their children, by the way, as well. So I genuinely think this is just dumb. And there are a load of groups which are basically, what you've got to remember, of course, is a lot of this campaigning stuff, we tend to regard it as wonderfully pure because it's non-commercial. These campaign groups, they're industries, okay? There's just a grievance industry, and they've got a vested interest in amplifying grievances. And the idea that, you know, you couldn't dream as a journalist of getting someone from Nestle on to talk about nutrition, but you would easily get one of these people in from one of these groups who's designed to tell you that, you know, burgers are terrible or whatever it might be, okay? And this is actually becoming a bit skewed because, you know, back in my childhood, those people were kind of volunteers on small salaries who really believed in what they're doing. A lot of these kind of grievance groups and these kind of victimhood groups are just an industry now. And yet we treat them with the kind of sanctity we used to treat volunteer groups with. So that's my rant on that. I think I've now hit 8:49, so it's probably due I went over to Q&As. So so that would be a great thing to do. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Rory. A couple of interesting insights there. As someone who's recently left academia to now be in corporate, I always enjoy hearing your take on the replication crisis. So let's actually look into the chat that I have in front of me here. Mike's comment you have already addressed. Mike, obviously, if you have any more questions or comments, please do post them in the chat, which goes for everyone attending here. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat now. Lee apparently is really enjoying your talk, looking very much forward to hearing you present again for the Global Vitality Conference next year. And they hope smoking cessation is a topic, so prepare for
Yeah,
that.
it will be. Yeah. I
Okay,
mean, obviously in the UK, thanks to the Behavioural Insights team and thanks to the Cameron government, we kind of won the argument, at least for long enough. And as a consequence, we have low smoking rates, and Public Health England declared that, I think they said it was 90% safer. I can't remember the exact figure, but 95, vaping is 95% safer than smoking. In fairness, I owe a lot of this to my father, who was a pipe smoker for years. And he'd be, as I said, he's still 94, 93, so he's okay on that score. You know, at this point, I don't think giving up would be a good idea. By the way, I'll also raise an issue which I'm discussing with a guy called Rob Horn at University College London, which is that he's unhappy about banning smoking in hospitals, which sounds like a really strange thing to do. And I said I'm also slightly unhappy about banning drinking in hospitals. And that was a really weird suggestion. Now, the only reason I say that is that I had two close contemporaries who are serious alcoholics. And both of them died in their 40s, okay? By the way, if you look at the people my age, my cohort who have died, okay, I'm 58. My cohort that's already dead, it's booze, 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 motorcycle, mountaineering. Those are the sources of death, just now, obviously anecdotal, okay? But if you want to die young, having a real alcohol problem is much more likely than actually dying really young through a smoking problem. I mean, in your 40s and 50s as opposed to your 60s and 70s. And in both cases of the two cases I know well, I don't know the third, I don't know the incident around the third case, I don't know enough of the circumstances of death. Undoubtedly, I think the reason for their death is they left going into hospital vastly too late. And the reason they didn't go into hospital is they knew you couldn't drink in hospital. And now I know that sounds really weird, but if you've just watched Painkiller or the other one, which is the documentaries on OxyContin, okay, that kind of behavior among extreme addicts, where you will literally, destroy things to get your next fix. That seems totally weird to a rational, detached human being, that you wouldn't go into hospital when you're really ill because you know you can't drink, smoke in hospital. But I think that's not a relevant factor, by the way. And I think, we have to be really cautious about that if we're genuinely trying to be kind, because I think the purists often are less kind than they believe they are. They've taken a kind of heuristic, which is the more difficult path of attack, the stricter path of attack is the better path of attack. And as in fairness to when I was a smoker, okay, Action on Smoking and Health, I really hated the guys because they were basically, the idea of, but you've got to really realize in the 1980s, the idea of banning smoking in pubs was kind of ridiculous because pubs were where places people went to smoke, okay? And, I hated those guys and I totally respect them now. Why? Because they changed their mind and they made an intelligent decision. So I apologize for any possible vilification I might have given you while you were a smoker, because you impressed me now. In retrospect. Now, there's another question, surprising insights applied strategically. Definitely looking at choice architecture, definitely looking at what I suppose the other thing I think, look, the real value of behavioral science in the applied and business world isn't that it provides you with the answers, okay? It's that it encourages you to ask better, wider questions. That's the main benefit. Okay, because we'll still need to test things individually in many cases. We can't just go, let's automatically produce 3 products because it improves the choice architecture. Kind of varies, right? Every situation is different. So you're going to have to test anyway. But if you can test more interesting things or come up with more interesting insights or more interesting hypotheses. So the biggest value is saying, do people do this for the reason they say? Do people do this thing for the reason we believe, or is there some other reason which really drives the behavior? And so in terms of the value of insights, in terms of the value of asking better questions, that's where the thing, Because, you know, if you ask people why they don't buy a product, they'll always say it's too expensive or I don't like it, right? Because that's their post-rationalization. And if you can go, you know, to be absolutely honest, okay, so probably one of the most valuable things is looking at, the tip I'll give is looking at behavior in a kind of path-dependent sequential way, looking for bottlenecks. Now, one speaker you ought to get on is a Kiwi called Clark Ching, who's written books on bottleneck theory. And if you look for his books on Amazon, but he taught me this whole thing of the theory of constraints. And okay, here's an insight, okay? Here's a really interesting behavioral insight. I think that almost all the world's coffee shops close too early, right? And the reason I think they close too early is that coffee shops, typically Starbucks, Costa Coffee, sell less in the last half hour they're open than they sell in the previous hours. And the assumption is, therefore, look, we can see in our data that sales tail off at 4:30. So we're going to close at 5. There's no point in opening to 6 because, look, the sales are tailing off, right? Now, I think I don't know how many of you, I realize I'm talking in Australia here, where, for all I know, you have 24-hour coffee shops. But this is what happens in the UK. The staff in the coffee shop, even in some cases, the owners of a privately owned coffee shop, want to go home early, okay? As a consequence, they want to do all the sweeping the floor, cleaning the bogs, scuzzifying the nozzle on the espresso machine, okay? They want to do that a bit earlier before they close, because otherwise they'll have to do it possibly after they're even paid, but they'll have to do it after the coffee shop closes and they'll get home later, okay? Consciously or unconsciously, particularly employees in coffee shops, and I know this because I've interviewed them, engage in a behavior when you're half an hour from closing, which is informally known as getting the mop out, okay? Now, getting the mop out means that if you start mopping the floor, or if you simply put a chair upside down on top of a table, you provide any indication that you're closing imminently, no one new will come in and your existing customers will basically clear off. Okay, so it's basically a massively strong, unwelcoming behavior. Now, if your boss came in and said, why have you put that chair upside on top of the table? You just go, oh, I was having to wipe the floor. Why have you got the mop out? I don't need it. It's got plausible deniability, but what you're actually doing is you're preventing new customers from coming in the last half hour you're open, and you're basically encouraging existing customers to piss off. Okay, and so my theory is that then creates data which suggests that people don't want to be in a coffee shop after 5:30, when actually the real data is people don't like being in a coffee shop when they think it's going to close shortly, because no one likes coming into a coffee shop when they feel time pressured, because it destroys the whole vibe, right? It's rather like going to a restaurant which says, yes, I will serve you, but I'll have to have your table back at 9. You go, fuck that. You know, I'm not eating under, you know, it's not an Olympic sport, okay? I'm not eating under the stopwatch. I'll go and eat somewhere else, right? And so it's really, really interesting, I think, that it's really, really interesting that we've probably just interpreted the data as there's no demand for coffee after 5:30. Now, you know, the traditional time for tea in England is 5 o'clock, right? And yet tea shops typically close at 4. And it's made no sense to me for ages. Now, some of them are lifestyle businesses. The people want to pick up their kids from school, etc. I kind of get that. Although why they don't pay someone to stay and keep the coffee shop open for a few hours later, I don't know. The tea shop, okay. But what I'm saying is that what's really going on, and the data may be telling you one thing, but the behavioral science is telling you something totally different. Okay, and I think there are loads of cases like that. I think where the data tells you one thing, which tends to be economically logical, and the behavioral science tells you something else, those are the real cases. Now, a case in that is the charge for a polythene bag, for a paper bag in a shop, right? Now, a load of economists started saying, well, if it works so well with a 10 or 20p charge for a bag, we should make it 50p. We should make it £1, because it's clearly about economic incentives. It wasn't. I think the reason that charging for paper bags worked was it changed a norm, because previously, if you bought 5 things from Boots, which is a chemist in the UK, okay, and they didn't just put them in a bag for you, it was rude. They couldn't just hand you a load of loose goods and go, here, take those and try carrying those back to your car, wanker, right? They can't do that. It's rude. They had to give you a bag because it was a social norm. It was a convention. It was polite, right? Just in the same way that if you go and spend 300 quid on clothes, they have to give you a bag with rope handles because those are the rules, right? If you spend 300 quid, you've got to have rope handles. You can't just have a polythene bag, okay? And so they'd done all this, and what it did is, because they were charging for the bag, they couldn't just give you one for default. They have to say, would you like a bag? And sometimes you look down, you're already carrying a bag which had some spare capacity, and you go, no, I don't want a bag. Okay, why would I pay? But actually, what it did is it got rid of a default and changed it to a question, to managed choice. It replaced a default with managed choice. And that's what was important about it. That's why it worked. Now, if you start charging 60p for a bag, one, you'll create a huge amount of annoyance and resentment. You'll utterly prevent a lot of impulse purchases, harming the retailers, and you won't have much reduction in the use of bags. Okay? So understanding when it's a behavioral explanation, because sometimes economics and behavioral science agree, they're just, in terms of the outcome, they're just different explanations for the same thing. So that's another example here. Coffee shops in Australia closing. Actually, you didn't invent the flat white, did you? That was the Kiwis. Oh God, I'm crazy. Oh no. Anyway, I think the argument is that the Kiwis created the drink and you created the name. So I think you can compromise that.
As a non-Australian, I've got no skin in the game. But yes,
you've got no skin in this game. No.
No, but some of the coffee shops, generally where I used to live, they close at 2 p.m. and I was like, oh well, that's going to be a long day then.
Of course, being Dutch, coffee shops have a different association view, which is their places where German tourists go to get stoned. Yeah.
Not going past a coffee shop in the Netherlands at 8 a.m. would be much more questionable than anywhere else in the world. That is for
yes.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's a great question. Yeah, exactly. The Saudis have got it right. I mean, actually, coffee culture, of course, partly because you don't have alcohol, but actually, coffee culture in the Middle East is fantastic. Is absolutely brilliant. I noticed that. I was in Amman, and the Costa was open till midnight. I remember that.
Oh, there you go. I'm surprised they have a Costa, to be honest. Question from Daniel. Back to vaping. What kind of things do you think companies like Philip Morris and sorts do to demonstrate vaping in a much more positive light? Have they used behavioral science to make their case?
The only I worry about with those companies is they're very adherent to regulations because they're very big. And they've to some extent been depositioned by the disposable vapes, which I don't like in environmental grounds. But I accept the fact, and I hate to say this, that one of the ways in which you make vaping successful as a tobacco smoking substitute is by making it ubiquitously available. Because one of the things I really campaigned against was having the same anti-vaping laws as anti-smoking laws, because that forces the vapors to go and stand in the same place with a load of smokers. And if their vape runs out of battery, or they just get tempted, okay, they're going to relapse to smoking. That's why Alcoholics Anonymous don't hold meetings in a pub, right? It's a bit too much temptation, isn't it? You know, my name's Rory and I'm an alcoholic. And then 10 feet behind my shoulders, oh, part of the usual, is it, Dave? You know, that's not going to work. And yet we make vapors go and stand with the smokers in offices. That's stupid. I just tell people in Ogleby, I said, I'm not supposed to say this and you didn't hear it from me, but go and find a discreet corner and go and vape away. You know, I don't want you to die because of our stupid policy. And the ubiquitous distribution is really important, and disposables unfortunately are important because people run out of battery, their charging is difficult, whatever it may be. Okay, now you can get these things with mega batteries, I agree, but a lot of people don't feel comfortable. There are a lot of people who are actually stealth vaping in offices and places and restaurants and pubs. And so, you know, they haven't been involved in the disposables because they've conformed to environmental regulation, and it's kind of depositioned them to an extent. So I'm a bit Byron Sharp. There you go, another New Zealander. I'm a bit Byron Sharp on the question of what you might call mental and physical availability, that people buy things very contextually. Now, I did have a solution to this, which I also thought solved the kids thing, which is in the UK, if you only allowed pubs to sell disposable vapes, it would be a new source of revenue for Britain's pub industry, and pubs are pretty good at not selling things to people under a certain age. Okay? So, you know, that was a solution. There is also a question about banning disposable vapes, which is they're a massive income source to hard-pressed, family-run corner shops. And, you know, to be honest, I think they make too much money out of them. But I don't want to see these shops closed because they're a really important service to the local community. You know, a lot of people without cars are forced to shop in them, and therefore you don't want those shops putting their prices up or anything else. If they can find another source of revenue, all well and good. This is one of the points Michael Hallsworth, you know, from the formerly of the Behavioural Insights team, he makes this point that really behavioural science should be the gateway drug to complexity theory. That looking at things systemically is the solution, you know, and you can't just look at, okay, there's this thing which replaces that thing. You've got to look at all those things like context, path dependency, etc. That's why I also recommend another New Zealander. I'm really giving the old Kiwi, the land of the long clouds, getting a lot of plugs today. That's why I also recommend the work of Clark Ching, by the way. It's really, really good.
All right.
And so the interesting one is the question about tests to preventing scams and fraud. One thing I'd like to test, and I've been trying to persuade an insurance company to test this for ages, is one of the reasons, and even I've done this, okay, I'll confess this, we lie a bit on insurance forms, is we don't know the consequences of telling the truth, okay? So this is what I'd like to do to encourage people to be honest on insurance forms. And I've suggested this to a few insurance companies in the UK now. If they have taken it up, they haven't told me about it or told me the results. But it's this, okay? Now, my car is parked about 100 yards from a public road because it's down a kind of private driveway, okay? It's behind locked gates, okay? And then the insurance form asked me, do you garage your car overnight? Now, nobody does that. It's not 1973, right? The rust problem's largely been solved. Nobody puts their car in a garage overnight unless it's the only place they can park, okay, right? So they asked this question on my car insurance form, which is, do you garage your car overnight? Or is it parked on the street? Now, neither of those is true. It's not parked on the street. It's parked on private land behind locked gates, some distance from the main road. We don't get many kind of random passers-by because we're in a cul-de-sac. Okay. And I go, well, technically, I can't tick the box saying it's parked on the street, okay, because it isn't, right? But so I'm going to say it's garaged overnight, even though I don't garage it overnight. Nobody does. In fact, the garage is full of junk. So if some insurance assessors had come around, I would have been banged right to results, or I would have been there at midnight emptying the garage. I'm not even sure my car fits in the garage, to be absolutely honest, okay, because I've never put it in there. Now, here's the thing, okay? The reason I lie is not because I'd rather save £20 than to tell the truth. It's because I don't know how much it costs me to tell the truth. Now, if I got to the end of the insurance quote and it gave me a second option to be truthful, and it said, you currently listed your car as being garaged overnight, okay? Lie. Okay? But if you prefer to have the option to park your car on the street, you can have this for an extra £20 a year, even £40 a year. I go, yeah, fine. Okay, it's worth £40 not to have that slight anxiety that I've told a bit of a porky pie. That's lie, by the way, sorry, rhyming slang. A bit of a porky pie on my insurance form. But the reason I lie is because I don't know if it's £100, £200, £40, £20. I don't know what that amount is, and my imagination goes, I bet if I tell the truth, they're going to totally stiff me here. Okay, and so we lie. Now, if you came back in and you actually said this is what it costs you to tell the truth at the end to people you suspected you lied, they'd mostly get, and you framed it as an option, okay? Now, obviously, you can't do that with something like drink driving. You know, if you'd like to own up to drink driving now, it's going to cost you about £1,000 a year, and they're going to find out anyway, so there's not much point in lying there. But in things like that, if you give people the option and you tell them how you make the process transparent, because the process of getting an insurance quote is not transparent. And so since we're gunning for the lowest quote we possibly can, we're always incentivized to put in the answer that has the lowest possible intimation of risk. Okay. And as a consequence, we kind of lie more than we'd like to because we don't know the consequences of individual truth-telling. And so that would be something I'd like to do as a nice little experiment.
All right.
And you're absolutely right. Pavlova was a Kiwi invention as well. Yeah.
The Pavlova is a Kiwi invention. It's also a massive point of contention between both New Zealand and Australia.
Don't ever get started, by the way. If you're ever in Peru or Chile, don't ever refer, if you're in Chile and you refer to pisco as the Peruvian national drink, they'll go totally insane. So there's certain things you've got to be really careful of. Yeah.
Good to have that cultural context. I can add to Lisa's question because I know the context in which she's asking it. So when she referred to fraud and scams, because she comes from a financial service background, as do I,
Yeah.
the main thing she's asking for is looking at scams, given that scams is a multi-billion-dollar industry for the scammers, it's costing us as much. The real question is, what kind of experimentation can you run to make sure people do not fall for scams or become increasingly willing to acknowledge that they may have been victims and do actually and actively seek out help?
Yeah, one of the things I think you have to bring back here, and this is a wider point about online businesses, is you have to bring back the good old phone call. Okay. And also we need to encourage younger people to use the phone, because I notice my kids are kind of like slightly phonophobic. But the simple fact is you can clear something up in a 5-minute phone call, which in an email exchange would take weeks. Okay. This is why I think Zoom is a really important technology, by the way, because getting people co-located synchronously can solve problems and arrive at conclusions inordinately faster than the asynchronous bureaucratic method, which is we've decided this, now we have to refer it on to compliance or something like that. So having really expert phone people, one of the ideas I'd most like to instigate is a mechanism for tipping. Now you've got to be careful there because it could lead to bribery, but but since calls are recorded, maybe it wouldn't. Okay, is a mechanism for tipping phone staff, because I think really, really good phone people who solve your problem should be paid $100,000 a year or more. I think it should be perfectly possible to earn $200,000 a year. After all, that's what a hell of a lot of traders in the city are. They're basically call center staff who are paid millions. Okay. But I think the value is difficult to quantify of a really good person solving a problem for you. It's difficult to quantify because it tends to result in loyalty rather than sales. And loyalty is both slower to measure and harder to measure. And as a consequence, we focus far too little on it. And I think that you have a lot of businesses now which are sludgy, which is that they're absolutely brilliant if you're a totally normal customer and everything goes right. But the second anything goes wrong, you're on the brink of disaster. You know, it's like, I literally had an insurance claim, which took mostly my wife, actually, more than me, because I would have lost my temper on the whole thing. It was literally, to get this insurance claim paid, took 30 hours of work. Okay. And it turned out, actually, at the end of this 30 hours, that the main reason the insurance company hadn't paid it is the hospital had invoiced us, and the insurance company couldn't pay, okay, until they'd invoiced the insurance company directly and issued a separate invoice, right? Now, that's a bureaucratic, not, you know, trivial detail. Now, a good person on the phone would have solved that in the first phone call, right? They would have solved that, and they would have saved us 30 hours of totally pointless work going, why have you not paid the hospital? Why are we getting threats from this hospital that our bill hasn't been paid when you have said you will pay this claim? Okay, I had a detached retina in Switzerland, if you want to know the details. So the phone call is really important, but the scam thing is really interesting, because there are, I think, I mean, there is a thing which is don't go on the internet if you're drunk or tired, by the way. Because
that is very fair, but I'm afraid most customers that once we know a financial service institution can spot that they are engaging in behavior which is likely a sign of a scam, and you know, these potential victims do get reached out to, and it becomes very clear that they are part of a scam.
I spoke to a bank in the UK where the other thing that happens is you refuse to pay because you think they've been the victim of a scam, and they get really angry with you. So this person was basically buying these selling bogus pedigree puppies, which never existed. The whole thing was a scam because it was being operated from a caravan site in Wales somewhere. And it was a sort of eBay arrangement or something. It wasn't eBay, it was something else, but where they demanded to pay and then they never delivered. And they spotted this payment and immediately refused it. And they had a furious customer on their hands going, I'm trying to buy a puppy here and you're preventing me. And it was only like weeks later when the person realized the bank had actually saved them. Because there is that problem, which is you add too much friction to purchases. And the problem with the internet is that the internet has to be calibrated to the world's least trustworthy person. It's not like a shop where you just have to calibrate it to the least trustworthy person locally and you know who the shoplifters are, right? If you're a local shop, right? Not a big shop, but a local shop. On the internet, you actually have to calibrate your levels of trust to the world's least trustworthy people. And that can make it unbelievably painful, genuinely painful. Now, I would say they're probably technological as well as psychological solutions to this. I mean, sort of text verification and identity verification. I would also argue that this is probably a cause for voluntary ID cards, which we've always resisted in the UK. We've rightly, I think, perhaps resisted compulsory ID cards, but I think allowing to have a voluntary mechanism where you identify yourself might be a great service to that. You know, it's great, you know, also for things like, you know, ratings on Airbnb, where, you know, bad guests arguably just start a different account in someone else's name. Okay. So now I don't want to get to the Chinese system of having, you know, individual ratings for your quality as a citizen. But I think we're in danger if we don't have some sort of voluntary system of making the world very difficult for honest people. And I'll give you a story about this. QVC, which you probably know of, I don't know if you have in Noz, it's a home shopping channel, TV channel. They had a system where they just stored people's credit cards on file, and people would ring up and they'd say, "I'd like this new zirconium bracelet, please." And they go, "That's Mrs. Johnson, is it?" "Yes." "Okay, it's £40 or 3 payments of £12.90, whatever it is. Do you want us to put it on your usual credit card?" They say yes. That was the sale. And then the credit card companies demanded that QVC demanded the CVV numbers from the back of the credit card, and QVC's sales dropped by 30%. So we've got a really important trade-off here. There's also a danger, by the way, that we make it really difficult for small businesses to compete with Amazon, okay? Because the small businesses, you know, will have to make payment 5 times more painful than it is on Amazon because they simply don't have the back-end systems to make it automated. Now, there is a solution to this, which is someone said to me the other day, they thought that GDP would go up by 1% in the UK if you just mandated that everybody had to use Google Pay or iPay, Apple Pay for websites. And that had to be an option. Because if you go to, now Shopify solves this problem, but if you go to a small online retailer and you want to pay by a credit card, you've got to input all those numbers. Now the Chrome browser makes it tolerably easy, I'll admit that, but there's a huge problem. There's a huge problem where simply because of what Richard Thaler called transaction utility, there's a much higher transaction utility if you go to Amazon, and there's a transaction utility if you go to, well, even Harrods, okay? You probably trust Harrods, but I mean, or Selfridges, but then there's an even lower level of transaction utility if you're going to a small website from a company you've never heard of. And so there's a problem in which this is becoming anti-competitive, I think. So I'm taking the opposite side here, which is just to say that, you know, there is a solution to this, obviously, to avoiding scams, but it probably means making the internet more or less unusable for for honest people. I think the other thing is that we could probably employ mass media in this, which is when there's a growing scam, we need to publicize it. You know, this is where push media could be really, really useful.
So as soon as we become aware of what types of scams, any kind of social media account that is relevant to the service provider should push out like, hey, this is absolutely not us. These are, maybe they should even publish a Spotify wrap up of the most famous scams of that year and what they end up expecting for the next year, which is
I would also argue I would have legislation which is that if you're selling things online, you're obliged to put a phone number somewhere clearly, because weirdly a phone call can establish an awful lot about trustworthiness generally. I'll tell you a lovely story about a scam, which was a British friend of mine moved to Australia and he needed to buy a car. And he sees a car advertised at quite a low price. And the guy says, right, if you want to buy the car, I'll meet you at the car park of a shopping mall.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm sure as an Australian, you go, no, mate, if I'm going to buy your car, I'm going to go to your home, right? I want to see where you live before I buy your car. And I want some evidence that it's the place where you live. Okay, right? But he thinks, oh, that's weird. In Britain, we go to someone's house, but maybe this is a cute Australian tradition where you buy and sell cars in the car parks of shopping malls, right? So he goes along, buys the car. I can't remember, it was either a cut and shut or it was stolen, or, you know, the whole thing was a total catastrophe. Anyway, ended up with this absolute piece of shit car. But his naivety was, you see, well, obviously we wouldn't buy a car from a supermarket car park in the UK, but maybe that's what Australians do. Now, maybe that is what you do, but I don't think it is it? That was a glorious case of kind of, you know, so there is another thing, which is that people who are culturally naive are disproportionately the victims of these things. You know, if you're a newly arrived migrant or asylum seeker or whatever, you are disproportionately prey to these things. And that's another thing to make you alert. You know, there are a lot, you know, and also the poor are disproportionately prone to them.
Well, as a migrant to Australia, then I should thank my lucky stars that so far, I have not been scammed yet.
You've not been scammed?
Not yet, yeah. Another question from Mike on a completely different tack. He loves the evolutionary take on the value of priming, though might the survival value be in terms of system 1 processing of associations? Simply a fast way to make judgments based on learned associations. So this is more towards the work of your fellow Sam Tatum. As a question.
Well, I'll end on a very good recommendation for people who have to go, because I realize I've overrun. And I meant to mention this earlier, which is, of the events of 2023 in behavioral science, I would include a publication by a British scientist who is also, he's a professor at the University of Sussex, but a bit of a tip for you, he's also a professor at the University of Melbourne. His name is Andy Clark. And he presumably spends the winter in Melbourne, so he's probably there right now, the British winter, I mean. He spends your summer in Melbourne, I'm assuming, if he's got his act together. So he's probably in Melbourne right now. Andy Clark is his name, and the book is called The Experience Machine. And it is an extraordinary revived but refined theory, originally held by some people in the 19th century, which when you read it, you realize is almost certainly true, which is that most of what we perceive is a prediction, and we use our senses to refine our predictions. So if you look at JPEGs or MPEGs or any form of data compression, okay, the way we limit the use of bandwidth on the internet is not by describing every pixel and every photo in painstaking detail. There's an expectation value for each pixel based on what's around it. Okay, and we only use data when that expectation value is incorrect, which is a much, much more economical use of available bandwidth than raw mode, to the digital photographers amongst you, which is where you describe every pixel individually and where the files are absolutely enormous. I've got a neighbor in Deal who's a professional photographer, and he had to come round to my flat to upload photos. Okay, this is still photographs, because he was using raw mode, because that's what you use if you want a lot of photo editing. You need raw mode. For looking at a picture, you need a JPEG. And in the case of a JPEG, it effectively says, okay, we'll have a prediction value, and we'll just use data to the extent that the expectation value, the reality differs from the expectation value. It looks like the brain does exactly the same thing. Evolution's come up with exactly the same data architecture as like Samsung, okay? Make the most efficient use of the optic nerve is prediction error correction, not generation of whole images. Now, once you read that, you realize that he's got implications for all kinds of mental health questions as well, like autism and schizophrenia, and explanations to some extent for what might be causing these conditions in terms of the balance between what you predict and what you perceive. Okay. So, for example, there are really interesting findings he advances, like about 40% of people with autism cut the clothing labels out of their clothes. Right? Now, that's nothing to do with branding or preventing resale. That's because they find them really, really irritating. Now, I'm probably a little bit on the spectrum, if I'm being absolutely candid, okay, but I don't get irritated by clothing labels. And the reason is that effectively it stops being a signal. Once I put the shirt on, even if it's got quite an intrusive label, I get used to it. It stops sending me the signal. Or rather, I stop registering the signal because it's just what I expect, and I reset it to 0. So I'm not going, oh, this label, right? It's really irritating me. And his suggestion is that autism may be a miscalibration effect, where you don't have that capacity not to, which is why social events and things, you know, become unbelievably difficult and unnavigable, because effectively you're being overly stimulated. Now, you know, it's a theory. but the implications, if you think about it, for marketing and behavioral science, that if we actually perceive, if a large part of what we perceive is generated internally rather than externally, then, you know, the role of marketing obviously becomes a lot more central, because what something tastes like is really a product of what we expect it to taste like as much as what it actually tastes like, right? And that may explain my Red Bull paradox, which is, why do so many people drink that tastes horrible? Which is, contextually, we expect medicinal products to taste horrible. So that book, I'd say, is a major publishing event. I'm going to give you another Aussie tip. There are two really good dissident Australian economists. One of them is called Steve Keen. He publishes on Substack. He's very interesting. The other guy is a friend of mine. I've only met Steve a couple of times. I like him very much, but I know Nick very well. Nick Gruen. You may know of him, but Nick Gruen has also got this really big idea, which I think is big in the behavioral sciences, to really avert political polarization, which is to create citizens' assemblies, which are a group of, say, 50 or 60 people selected to be representative by lot. So much more akin to a jury than a parliament, okay? In that you're selected to serve in this thing rather than selecting yourself. And he has seen evidence where these citizens' assemblies engage in deliberative democracy and actually come up with acceptable compromises and actually creative resolutions to problems that have proved insurmountable in politics. And I think that idea of injecting effectively another chamber into politics, where you go, you won't be allowed to do this if 100 representative people think it's stupid. Now, one of the things, I went to see a talk he gave at Nesta in the UK, where there were quite a few people from the BIT. And one of the things I said is, you shouldn't just use this for future decisions. You should use it for decisions that have already been made, to kill off bad government decisions, to avert the problem of what you might call policy sunk cost bias, where I've invested so much in promoting this policy, I can't afford to admit that it's failed. So one of the assertions I made is that if you'd had this kind of deliberative democracy, our high-speed rail project would have been killed off, certainly in COVID, okay? Because the argument is, look, the whole pattern of travel has changed. We cannot use the same business case to build this railway that we did in 2010, okay? The whole patterns of travel and commuting have been completely changed. But to be honest, it probably would have killed off the railway before COVID, when people just decided it was done. Okay, so that, I think, is a really big idea, that there's a missing component to the democratic process, in the sense that the democratic process consists of, you know, law, bureaucracy, politics. Okay. Mm-hmm. I argue, and I argue this repeatedly, that I don't think I voted to remain in the European Union, not very enthusiastically, but I voted to remain. The immediate conclusion was that all people who voted to leave were like racist idiots. And I said, no. It's a perfectly rational decision based on the fact that you're never going to get a chance to vote out again, and based on an observation that people in the politicosphere are disproportionately keen on international globalized projects of scale. Okay. And I said, if you believe that the European Union was potentially dangerous in 15 years' time, and you thought this was the only chance you got to vote to leave, okay, then voting to leave was, from precautionary principles, a perfectly sensible thing to do. Because all you noticed was this would never happen again. We'd never be given another referendum on this topic. So now's your only chance to vote no. Okay. And secondly, if you believe that there was just a 20% chance that that Britain would go into the euro or something like that, okay, in another 10 years' time, because you get a really euro enthusiastic government in, then voting leave is perfectly rational. And to disparage anybody for doing it, in fact, to praise the people who just said GDP might fall by, those are the people who are being narrow idiots, not the people who voted leave in many respects.
All right. Well, Rory.
The reason I make this point is, if you'd said, okay, we have a citizens' assembly of people, and if ever this reaches a 55% vote that we should have a referendum on EU membership, okay, that referendum takes place. A lot of, certainly 5% of people would have voted to remain, and I would have voted to remain much more enthusiastically. So, you could deploy this as a really, really interesting new. To be honest, you could just do it for the creative value. And also for the value that interesting experiments or ideas could be tested this way, which government on it, politics on its own wouldn't have the courage to propose.
All right. Not a topic I thought we would end on, but happy to end it nonetheless. Thank you so much for this session, Rory. Very happy that you were able to spare us another 30 minutes as we have.
That's a pleasure.
As we have managed to discuss everything ranging from vaping to coffee shops to Brexit and a more political approach to the citizen assembly structure. Guys, for everyone here on the chat, please thank Rory for his time, enthusiasm, and his amazing insights. It is, as Aaron mentioned at the beginning, if you weren't here, I'll happily reiterate, the last session of the year. We won't try to put you get you into a meetup end of December. Like, we do realize you might have more important things to do at that time. As always, this session is recorded, so do feel free to share it with any of your fellow behavioral science colleagues and or enthusiasts. And we will be back in the new year, probably end of January or end of February. Make sure to continue to check the social media for whenever the next one may occur. And although it may be a bit early, given that it is only end of November, we hope that you have an absolutely splendid Christmas or other cultural celebrations that you may celebrate, and an absolutely splendid Rutsch, which is the Dutch and German way of saying entry into the new year.
Absolutely fantastic. Have a great Christmas, everybody, and see you, I hope, next year. Either in person. I'd desperately love to get down. I've never been to Melbourne apart from anything else, which is one of my places on the bucket list. Sounds absolutely fantastic. And but if not, I'll see you virtually.
Sounds good to me.
Let's book it in, Rory. Come on down, mate.
All the best. I loved it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, mate.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.